How do you know if your tank is ready for fish? This is a super common question on whether I get it for YouTube or we'll find them online, etc. And I wanted to go through kind of a short process that isn't just, well, test your tank, right? Let's walk through that process, talk about how you know whether or not your tank is ready for fish, and how you can get lots of success in the future and not have as many fish be lost. Hello everyone, this is Bentley, and today we're going to talk about the difference between knowing when a tank like this is ready versus a tank like this cloudy thing down here. When we're typically looking at whether or not our tanks are ready for fish, most often we're going to go to one of these things. Test strips, right? We're going to look at our ammonia, our nitrite, our nitrate. We kind of have a basic understanding of the nitrogen cycle, but if for some reason you don't, let's cover that real fast. When our fish poop, produce waste, right? They are producing ammonia. And the beneficial bacteria in our aquariums is consuming that ammonia and turning it into nitrite. And then there is another type of beneficial bacteria that is consuming that nitrite and turning it into far less harmful nitrate. And then there's multiple ways we can deal with the nitrate. We can either A, have a nice planted tank and the plants will consume the nitrates for us, or B, we do water changes. If you're doing something like African cichlids or some kind of fish that can't live with plants, this is the most common way, is basically to pull out water and dilute it with fresh water that has none of those things in it, so that you constantly keep at a safe level. Typically, most people try to target something about 40 ppm nitrate or lower, although this can be very dependent on your local water, how much maintenance you want to do, and some of the fish you're keeping. Usually, we use these to inform ourselves. But is this the perfect answer? No. While test strips are really nice, and they give us an idea from a biological standpoint what's going on in the tank, sometimes people will do a test and see zeros across the board, go, oh, my tank's perfect, it's ready for fish, when there actually isn't a bacterial colony that has produced. And often what we'll do is when we're setting up a new tank, we'll set up our tank. Maybe if we're doing plants, we'll start our initial planting. We could give an example like brother-in-law James's tank. Here's a quick little picture of that bad boy when we set that thing up a little while ago. But if you haven't used some kind of product or you don't have plants, how do you know when the beneficial bacteria is starting to grow? You do need to initially feed this bacteria, which is where old methods would often buy like one or two kind of basic fish to start off and start very low, to produce a little bit of waste and let the beneficial bacteria naturally build up in your filter. But modern days, it's very easy to do it with basically just plants, right? Because there will always be bacteria on the surface of plants where you buy them from, and that's slowly going to populate throughout the aquarium and into your filter, etc. But just testing it, if you see zeros everywhere, you might not have enough of a bacterial colony to make sure that you could handle a significant increase in the amount of waste happening in your aquarium. So here's how we do that in a safer method. It will depend on whether or not you have a planted tank or non-planted tank. In the case of planted tanks, this is a little bit faster process and a little bit easier. But let's start with non-planted tanks, because we can start that way and apply it to planted and just kind of have a slightly faster process. There's kind of two methodologies. You can use something like ammonium chloride powder. This stuff right here, right? This is going to produce small amounts of ammonia. You measure it out, you allow your beneficial bacteria to have some food, and you keep monitoring until the amount of ammonia you put in the tank initially goes down to zero. There is a problem with this in that it's very easy to dose this too high. What you realistically want to target is about 1 to 2 parts per million, which again requires some of our testing strips, but not all testing strips read ammonium chloride, which is the free ammonia, as well as they do other ammonias. There's kind of two types. There's NH3 and then there's NH4+. They're both ammonia compounds. We're getting into chemistry, I know, but basically some tests will only read the NH3, some will read both. Liquid test kits like the API Master Kit or the Tetra 6-in-1 strips both read all of the types of ammonia. So those are the safest ones. There are other options out there, but those are the two that I know and use the most. The second option is just fish food. This is empty, but if we're using our fish food, we can roughly guess the amount of food that we would feed our aquarium each day. And if, before we ever put fish in there, we put that amount of food in there, and let it deteriorate, it will naturally turn into ammonia, and thus can feed our bacterial colonies and produce our initial bacteria colonies. You can also speed this process up by getting a Kickstarter like this. This is Fritz Zyme 7. There's a number of different bacterial kickstarts. There's Turbo Start. There's There's lots of good ones out there. This just happens to be the one I have on hand at the moment and have used in a most recent tank. These can be really awesome products to speed the process up, but keep in mind if you're going to use a Kickstarter like this, you have to have some kind of food, whether that is actual fish food or ammonium chloride, etc., for that bacteria to feed on and use. Because if you just pour this in and you have nothing in there for that bacteria to feed on, it's not going to propagate all the way and it will die. What I would say is the biggest problem in all of this is that we have to do this thing that most of us fish keepers are terrible at doing, being patient. Often we want to rush, we want to get those fish, we really want to enjoy our tank, we want this, and we don't want to take the time to wait for it to grow in or for the fish to be ready and all those kind of things, right? We want to rush because we get super excited because we got this fish we really want. I've done it, you've done it, it's okay, right? But here's the thing. If we exercise a little patience, if you have a non-planted tank, I would typically say give your tank at least a month to cycle before putting fish in there. And one of the things we can try to look for is if we start seeing, typically it's going to start as brown algae or diatomaceous algae, but if we start seeing surface algae form on the glass, this is a really good sign. Usually when algae is beginning to form, it means that we have enough things going on, and very commonly we have plenty of bacterial colony that has established to handle our first set of fish. That's a great sign. Don't freak out when you see algae. It's one of the most natural parts of the full nitrogen cycle is seeing algae formation, especially brown algae or diatomaceous algae. This is extremely common in the early stages. It goes away over time, don't stress, and then you have a beautiful aquarium and you're ready for fish. I like about a month. I think that's typically like the safe route. I know it's really hard to be patient for a month and stare at that empty tank just like, but where are my fish? Right? Don't get me wrong. I'm doing it. I have a tank I'm using as an experiment that won't have fish in it. It drives me crazy every time I come in here. So I'm like, it should have fish, but I must experiment, right? It like short circuits my fish keeper brain. But here's the thing. If you have a planted tank, this can speed the process up because the plants will also consume some of the waste. So they take some of the burden off of the necessity for the beneficial bacteria to be present in order to make sure that the water parameters stay safe. So I would say that within 2 weeks, you're relatively safe on a planted tank, as long as you don't have big plant die-off, right? If everything's looking good in your plants, you're relatively safe to start adding some fish. This does not mean go add 40 fish to your tank. Start small. And the reason we start small is because when we add our first few fish, let's say we've got a 20-gallon long, okay? We might only add like 8 cardinal tetras, right? Something simple. Why are we starting small? Why are we starting so simple? We don't want to suddenly create a massive spike in the amount of waste that is entering the aquarium, because we might have an initial established beneficial bacteria colony, or we're going to rely on plants to help us out while that bacteria colony fully fleshes itself out. If we suddenly have a huge spike in waste, we go and add 40 tetras instead of 8, right? All of a sudden what we run into is a risk of those parameters spiking really hard, and all of a sudden having a big ammonia spike which can kill all of our fish, or having a different type of spike where we get big bacterial blooms in the water and the water gets very cloudy. Like you can see, this is slowly making its way out of Cloudy Town. I had a bacterial bloom because despite having no fish in there, I used a big kickstart, I was feeding it with ammonia, and boom, just huge bacterial kickstart went off because I used a little too much kickstart. I'll be fully honest, it was my fault. Follow directions, right? One of those things. But these are ways that we can kind of safeguard. And then what we can do is, like, after 2 weeks of those first 8 fish, now we can add a few more. And we can add a few more. If you are willing to be a little more patient, I know it's super hard, believe me, even for me, it's incredibly hard to be that patient about adding fish. I want to add like 15 rainbows to a tank right away and watch them swim and just be like, doing this, right? But if we be a little patient and we kind of add the first few fish, and then once we're like a month or so into having a reasonable number of fish, maybe it's somewhere between 10 and 20 fish in your tank, then you can go and look about adding more fish in a larger amount. So maybe if you added just cardinal tetras to start, you started with 8 and then you moved up to 20 and now you want to add some corridoras. You don't have to do it like 5 corridoras now and then 2 weeks, 5 more corridoras. You probably add all the corridoras you're going to add. Or maybe you're going to add a pleco or something like that, right? Whatever those fish may be, you're probably safe to add. Just don't stock too crazy. So if your tank has 20 fish right now, let's say we're at this 40-gallon breeder and we're doing lots of little fish, I've got 20 tetras in there, and they're doing great, everything's looking good. Great. You can probably add about double that number of fish, which is to say, if you have 20 now, you can probably go to another 20 more fish being added without seeing some crazy spike. But that assumes that they're roughly similar in the amount of food they consume. If we're suddenly going from like 10 cardinal tetras to 10 rainbow fish, right? 10 significantly larger fish, or 10 plecos as an example, something that eats a lot more food, we would want to not do as many at a time. Slow and steady wins the race. Just like the way I do CO2, low and slow, we want to slowly add our fish, let our tank get accustomed to that, and then we will have minimal problems in the long run. The only thing we might run into is maybe we get a little too heavy-handed with feeding every once in a while, and you might see a small algae outbreak, but those are all things you can handle in time. I hope this helps. I think often the message is just if we test all zeros, we're safe and it's time to add our fish. And often we miss the part that anything you're building out, you want to slowly gauge it out over time, let it kind of adjust as you make each state change, right? We're trying to control nature, this very chaotic, amazing thing, in a small glass box of water. So when we are doing that, if we go slow, we be a little patient, even though it's hard, do not get me wrong, even though it's hard, we will find significantly more success in the long run. That's it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a little thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you're not a subscriber. It's one of the best ways to help your friendly neighborhood YouTube. Psycho personality? I don't know. What do you want to call me? Random guy who likes fish on the interwebs. And more importantly, let me know down below, what have you found to be the best way when you set up a new aquarium, if you have multiple aquariums like me, to help make sure that you don't run into problems? Or maybe you've got a horror story that you want to share down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.